Okay, welcome to Chapter 8, The Federalist Years. We just finished Chapter 7, which was the critical period, where we saw the ratification of the Constitution, and now we are moving into the real launching of a new government, the real experiment that the United States is going to take part in. This is when you'll see George Washington in action as president, really, and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, all just really interacting and coming into conflict with one another, and we'll see the emergence of political parties, and so there's a lot happening in this chapter. So this is section 1 today, launching a new government. Here you have vocabulary terms that you're going to see on your quiz tomorrow. You might want to spend some time looking at the definitions that I've given you here. Notice that strict constructionist, the definition actually goes up to the next column. And Judiciary Act, that bullet point should have been moved in, but it is where we organize 13 district courts, one for each state, and set our number of Supreme Court justices. That bell work is for tomorrow, and these are your objectives for this section. You should be able to summarize the major activities involved in the organization of the new government, explain the significance of the Bill of Rights, describe Hamilton's financial plan and the controversy it created. Okay, so part of us launching our new government was organizing the new government. So there's some things that we needed to establish that we didn't have right from the get-go. So apart from things like the Senate and the House of Representatives, we're going to have things like the president's cabinet, and this is his advisory body. These are the people that the president gets advice from, and they have different functions and different things that are expected of them. So the three main departments within the cabinet are the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the War Department. And the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The first Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. And the first head of the War Department was Henry Knox. Also, George Washington thought it fit to appoint Edmund Randolph as the first Attorney General to just pretty much provide legal advice for his administration. Now, the people within the cabinet are going to have very different political views, which is something I want you guys to think about when you look at your discussion posts that you'll be doing some point between this week and next week. Is how does this work when we have a body of people that have to work very closely together that have very, very different views? Okay. Also organized at this time are our courts. The Judiciary Act of 1789, like I was telling you with your vocab, they established 13 district courts, one for each of the colonies. There's also 3 circuit courts, and those are the courts that will hear the appeals. So, like, if you went to court and the decision wasn't really in your favor, but you wanted to appeal that decision, maybe there was a mistake, maybe there's some new evidence that came to light, you would go to these 3 circuit courts. And the act also set our Supreme Court justices to a number of 6. John Jay is also appointed the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. And thirdly, if you remember, we talked about when we were discussing ratification, states like Virginia didn't want to ratify the Constitution unless they were guaranteed that Congress would meet again and come up with a Bill of Rights that was going to protect the people's individual rights that weren't mentioned in the Constitution. So Congress, in its first session, what lasted 2 years, did a lot. They accomplished a lot of things in a short amount of time. So they drafted the Bill of Rights, which we'll discuss. I don't know if it's in this section or the next. They organized the executive branch. They organized the judicial branch. And then they have to start talking about financial measures, because if you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the government didn't have the power to tax, really. It could tax, but it couldn't enforce it, so that's pretty much like not having the power at all. So this new government's got to figure out how are we going to go about collecting taxes, and what is our currency going to look like, and what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. How are we financially going to function and survive and thrive as a nation? Okay, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights includes the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And we're going to go into more detail about these tomorrow when you're in class. The first amendment actually has 5 parts. It's where we have our freedom of religion specifically stated, freedom of speech, freedom of press, assembly, petition. And we'll go more into what these things mean later. Assembly would mean like we have the right, we have the freedom to gather, and to gather when we are in protest of something. We have the right to petition. So we have a right when, if you guys, I don't think you guys have ever been asked to sign a petition. Maybe you have, I don't know. We can present petitions to our representatives to show them that we care about a certain issue, or we're against something and we want them to do something about it. We have the right to bear arms. We have the right to not house troops during peacetime. And you know how important that was to the colonists because they had experienced that with the Quartering Act under British rule. We're protected against unreasonable seizure and search of our property in our homes. Amendments 5 through 8 goes through what is the fair judicial proceedings for someone that is accused of a crime. You know, that they would have a speedy trial, that they're not left to pretty much rot in a prison for years before they come to trial. And these are things that did happen under the British rule, so that's why they're being addressed in the Bill of Rights. Also, Amendments 9 and 10 deal with restraints on national power, leaving things up to the states, kind of guaranteeing states' rights as well. Okay, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, is a financial genius. He's pretty much why the country is able to survive in these early days financially and begin to have revenue. He is not American born. He was born in the Caribbean. He becomes orphaned at an early age. Somehow he's kind of like a rags to riches, which is interesting when we get more into his political beliefs, but he's rags to riches kind of story. He moves to New York to go to school. He goes to King's College. Somehow during the Revolutionary War, he ends up as Washington's chief of staff. So Washington builds a relationship with him. He knows what this man is capable of, that he's very intelligent and kind of trustworthy guy. And so that's kind of how Hamilton becomes one of these founding fathers that we talk about. So Hamilton has different plans for resolving our nation's debt, because we have a lot of debt after the Revolutionary War. And some of that's in your vocab when we talk about the idea of funding at par and assumption. We want to do that so that other countries will extend credit, and then that way they'll want to trade with us. So if they're trading with us, we'll be making more money, we'll be able to pay off that debt, and it'll just kind of all work itself out. Alexander Hamilton also wants to create a national bank and a national mint, meaning a place where we're going to make money, so that all of the colonies have the same money. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, we had all different kinds of money, and that was very complicated and confusing. And when other countries are trying to trade with us and they're getting 13 different types of money, it just didn't really work out well. It didn't look good. It made people kind of think that we weren't one nation, and we were trying to get away from that idea. Hamilton, who will be a Federalist when we get to the political parties, he wants to encourage manufacturing, industry. We need to expand economically. We need to not depend on just agriculture and farming. He wants America to kind of already begin to modernize. Like, this is the way of the future. This is what we need to do to make money. He, being a Federalist, like I was saying, rags to riches, it's interesting because Federalists were really in favor of the elites ruling. So, like, the intellectually elite, the economically elite. These are the people. These are the best people. These are the people that should be in charge. Not just the common man. We shouldn't just let anyone vote, really, you know. We should let people that we would consider like the cream of the crop. They should get the vote because they know what's going on. That's kind of what Hamilton's belief is. And that's going to be in contrast with Jefferson's beliefs. Okay, so these are the other parts, well, some of the stuff already mentioned, of Hamilton's plan. The report on public credit is pretty much his writing, giving his whole financial plan for the United States. Talked about funding, meaning we are going to take on all of our debt at face value with interest. It almost seems like Hamilton really wants to have the most amount of debt possible, and that's because the more debt, the more credit he can get from other countries, which is going to make countries more likely to trade with us because they're going to kind of want their money back. So kind of this like circular process that Alexander feels is going to get the country out of debt. Then there's assumption. Assumption is assuming all of the debt by all of the states. Now we are going to not just have Virginia's debt and North Carolina's debt and South Carolina's debt. It's going to be the nation's debt. It's going to be the debt of the United States. He does this in part because he thinks that it will tie all of the states to the federal government's kind of chariot. All of the states now have to kind of depend on this national government working out. And a few of the states disagreed with this because, namely Virginia, they had already paid off their debts, and they didn't see why they were going to have to now pay off another state's debts. And how this gets passed through is there's a big bargain, which pretty much leads the capital because they hadn't selected where the capital city was going to be. They were meeting between Philadelphia and New York City for most of this time period. They get Virginia to agree because they agree to move the capital city to what will become Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is pretty much like built from scratch, and they create the District of Columbia for the capital city. Okay, the second part of his plan is the national bank. We want to have all the same money throughout the whole country, so we need that mint. We need a place also to put all of our tax money that we collect. And he thinks that the national bank will be a source for business loans. So people across the country can take out business loans, invest in manufacturing, all of these things that are going to increase revenue in our country. So Alexander Hamilton has a very flexible reading of the Constitution. He feels like all of these ideas fall under the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause, sometimes we call it. And him and Jefferson are going to argue a lot about this. Hamilton's going to say that necessary and proper means whatever kind of makes our lives easier, whatever is convenient for the country to do, we should be able to do. Jefferson says, no. Necessary and proper means what is essential, meaning what we must do to survive. And they'll write letters back and forth. They're writing both to Washington, arguing their different points on this issue. So we would consider Hamilton and the Federalists to be loose constructionists, flexible reading, and Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans to be strict constructionists. They don't want anything, they feel that anything outside of what the Constitution specifically states, those things should be left up to each individual state to decide for themselves. Okay, so here's your paragraph shrink. Conflict, personality, issues. Pause, take a second, write a good summary. I'm going to ask you for these tomorrow. I hope this wasn't too difficult to follow along with. If you have any questions, you had any problems, we can talk about this tomorrow in class. All right, guys. Good night. Oops, totally forgot. Here's your SRQ. You can go through all of these.